Would you make the same argument with regard to a lunch counter in the American South that didn't serve African Americans on the grounds that most of our customers are white segregationists and don't want to eat in a lunch counter or in a restaurant that has African Americans?
I mean, I do believe that the problem with discrimination based on race is much bigger.
How is it different?
Let him answer.
You can change your appearance.
Really?
Disagree.
All right, one possible difference is the one Josh just suggested, that it has to do with whether the characteristic is immutable or not. Josh, you think that immutable characteristics are illegitimate bases, whereas changeable ones are acceptable?
Exactly. For example, I have an earring. I have a piercing in my left ear.
Yeah.
When I go to a job interview, I do not wear my earring because I don't want others' perception tainting whether or not I get the job, because my appearance is changeable in that respect. I wouldn't wear shorts and a t-shirt to a job interview.
Josh, let's examine reason by reason a possible basis for distinguishing lookism in employment from racism. What about religion? No Catholics or Jews need apply. Now, you can change your religion.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting... it's definitely a different situation because it is changeable, but at the same time, it's something that's so emotionally charged.
Appearance is emotionally charged as well. Why should I have to change the way I look?
Your religion doesn't change the way, how you can perform a job.
But the issue is whether what counts as a legitimate basis for hiring is based on what's immutable or is based on what is relevant to performing the job. Alex, what do you think about that?
I definitely think that there should be anti-discriminatory laws regarding race.
Based on race?
Yeah.
And so how would you articulate the principal distinction between laws preventing racism in employment and laws preventing lookism?
Race is something that you have no control over, absolutely no control. And you can be of a different race and still be beautiful. I don't know, I don't understand why it even should be a concern when it comes down to employment.
But suppose that restaurant in the segregationist South says, if we have African American waiters or customers in here, we will do less business because our clientele is segregationist and they won't eat here. Why should the law prevent that business from making that decision to maximize its profits?
I would interpret it almost as a violation of the freedoms of the African American people in that place. And it's based on something that they cannot control. I don't understand why it wouldn't be a violation.
And if someone is
rights.
homely or ugly by Abercrombie's standard and therefore can't get a job, are they in any more control of their looks?
It's much harder to change your race than to change your looks overall. One is
And
impossible,
that's
the other one is
the
possible.
basis for distinguishing the laws. And remember, if it's mutability, then religion, it's all right to discriminate on the basis of religion in hiring?
I guess we think of looks as something much more superficial than religion or race, whereas I really don't see it in equal terms. To me, religion and race are much more defining of the characteristic of a person.
Take another kind of job about which there's been a controversy over discrimination in employment, Hooters. Do you know what those restaurants are? Anybody? Jamie?
I've never been to Hooters. Basically, they're a pub. All of their waitresses are scantily clad and meet physical specifications, and so men enjoy to be served by these women.
And some women.
And some women are turned down from the opportunity to work just because they don't have the requisite breast size.
Well, so the market's going to find a different place for them.
You can say the same
market's
thing
going to find a
about
different
the
place
race.
for the black person
Yeah,
who wants to
exactly.
apply for the southern
can-
Actually, I
restaurant.
don't necessarily agree with this, because if it's a norm that's perpetuated all across society, that person actually might be left without a job. Whereas if a woman doesn't have the necessary physical structure or breast size, and she cannot work in that specific restaurant, she can still go and work in another service or industry.
There was a suit brought by a man who applied to be a waiter at Hooters, and no men are hired as waiters. And he claimed this was unjust discrimination. What do you think about that one, Josh? Does he have a case?
I think that's more objectionable because of the fact that it's gender and sex discrimination as opposed to an appearance.
But you can change your sex.
You can change your sex.
But what if I like it the way I am? This is against my freedom. This is against my liberty.
Against my
But no one's
identity.
forcing you to do
Okay,
it.
say we actually impose on this restaurant to actually hire men. Then they lose like half of their clientele because more men are going to stop going there. But say if that whole business shuts down, your social pie is shrinking.
Maybe it's worth it to have a smaller
maybe we
social
can
pie
live in like
and a
very,
nicer population.
And live like in a super idealistic world with like
Everybody
no pie.
knows
So
how
you,
these women are objectified. Everybody knows how they're
And again,
treated.
I'll
and
go.
it still
Have you
continues.
ever asked women how they feel to work there?
I've read court cases.
You've read court cases, but you do not know in the aggregate or the sum total. It is probably in the worst interest of that company to,
They've been
to
around for
hire.
like
You
to hire
can't
solely
count on
that
that
money.
for social
It's a bad
change.
company,
You
you know?
can't.
Ryan, do you agree with Nicole that the consumer preference to which Hooters is catering is morally objectionable?
I would say it's pretty morally objectionable to go to a restaurant simply because you think that the waitresses are attractive.
But that's not a sufficient reason
That's not a
to make it
sufficient
against
reason to
the
ban
law.
them. I wouldn't make
All
a
right,
law
and
against
Well,
them.
you think it's discriminatory to not hire someone based on their gender?
I think there's a distinction here that we haven't made explicit. The difference between a consumer and employer preferences. So in this case, the consumer is having these preferences. And in the case of whether or not we find it morally objectionable for an employer to discriminate, it's an employer.
I have to disagree with you against
Okay.
here, because eventually what the employer wants to do is to satisfy the consumer so he gets good profit. So in both cases, it's the exact same thing, whether it's consumer or employer. It's just going from the other way around.
Let's assume that in each case, the employer is not independently racist or sexist or enamored of beautiful-looking people, but simply responding to consumer preferences, trying to maximize profit. Which of those customer preferences are morally legitimate for the business to cater to? When should the law intervene to prevent labor markets from expressing or responding to certain preferences of consumers? Some of you have drawn distinctions between sexism, lookism, and racism. Now, one approach to these questions is to say discrimination is bad. Discrimination is wrong, it's unfair. But as we've looked closely at these cases, all of them in a way involve discrimination. Whenever an employment decision is made, strictly speaking, that's discrimination. So we've been debating what are legitimate grounds for discrimination. And that's driven us to harder questions about what is the legitimate purpose of a business and what are morally legitimate consumer preferences, which suggests that the question of the role of markets in hiring and employment, figuring that out, forces us to confront sometimes controversial conceptions of the good, of the worthy, of the legitimate preferences that customers bring to markets.